Good afternoon. I'm Kara Gavin, a member of the Michigan Medicine Department of Community. Thanks for your patience as we work through some technical issues. I'm delighted to have you join us. Today, we'll explore the university's rich medical history as part of our celebration of the 175th anniversary of the opening of the University of Michigan Medical School. It welcomed its first students in early fall of 1850 and paved the way for the development of everything we now know as Michigan medicine. We're also marking the 100th anniversary of the opening of the university hospital that many called Old Main, which served as our flagship for patient care from late summer 1925 through early 1986. Some of you watching may remember getting care or visiting patients at Old Main, or working, training, or volunteering there. We're incredibly fortunate to have a panel of 4 medical school experts with us today who are not only physicians, but historians as well. Thank you to everyone who sent in questions in advance for our experts to address. And we're also going to take some live questions after their presentations and share information about a special museum exhibit about our history that opens this weekend in Ann Arbor. If you're watching this live, you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Dr. Joel Howell is the Elizabeth Farrand Collegiate Professor Emeritus of Medical History, a Professor Emeritus of Internal Medicine in the Medical School, and Professor Emeritus of History in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. He's a general internist and a historian, and co-wrote a book on our history that's available through the U of M Press. Dr. Kazanjian is a Professor Emeritus of Internal Medicine, of History, and of Epidemiology in the School of Public Health. He led our division of infectious diseases for more than 2 decades and wrote a book about one of the leading microbe hunters of our history. Dr. Laura Hirshbein is the George E. Wantz, MD, Distinguished Professor of History of Medicine, a Professor of Psychiatry, and a Professor of History. She is a psychiatrist and author of 2 books on the history of mental health in America, and serves as the lead for the history of medicine and public health in a new center headed by our next guest, Dr. Lisa Harris, who's the director of the Center for History, Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences in Medicine, a new entity in the medical school that we call CHASM for short. She's also the George E. Wantz Professor of Interdisciplinary Enrichment in Medicine and a Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology in the medical school, as well as a Professor of Women's and Gender Studies. At this time, I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to talk about the particular aspect of our history and how it relates to what Michigan medicine is today. Following their presentation, we'll begin the Q&A session. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Joel Howell, who is going to give us some general highlights from our history, including more about the medical school's early days and about the Old Main Hospital and the Simpson Institute that opened shortly after it. And Dr. Howell, when you're ready.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It was about 200 years ago, almost 200 years ago, that Michigan became a state. One of the very first decisions made by the new state legislature was that there should be a state university and that it should be located in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They then went on and said in that university, one of the schools should be a medical school. Given the time when most people didn't go to medical school, this was a very forward-looking move. The next slide shows the medical school as it appeared in 1850 when the school opened. And the slide after that shows an announcement for an early session. And I want to point out on this slide a couple of important aspects. One is that it emphasized the fact that the medical school was part of the larger university. This was a strength of the medical school then and is today. And second, it's interesting that many of the people arrived by train. We still have a train to Ann Arbor, and some people still do arrive by train. The next slide shows the first medical building. Now, the state of medical education was quite a bit different in those days. You didn't need to have a high school diploma to get in. It was only 2 years long, and there was no clinical instruction whatsoever. And also the classes were not graded. And by that, I don't mean A, B, C, and D, but rather the second-year students heard the same classes as the first-year students. And it was a tradition that the second year students would wake up the first year students in time for the good jokes. The next slide shows you an example of how things were a little bit rowdier. This is a self-portrait of a bunch of medical students, and you'll note the bottle in the front along with the various skeletons. The next slide shows the schedule from one of the early years. And I want to focus down at the bottom on the next slide, and particularly on rule number 4, which states that students are expected to maintain order and to avoid all rough sport, the throwing of missiles, etc., during class. We continue to think this is a very important rule, and we encourage our students not to throw things at us as we are lecturing. The next slide starts us into a discussion of some of the University of Michigan's leadership roles. And one of them had to do with the question of where we should teach medical students. As I mentioned, there was no clinical instruction at the University of Michigan. There was no clinical instruction at any medical school anywhere in the country. And there were debates about whether or not the university ought to run a hospital. It went to the regents, and people said, what's the point of having a medical school run a hospital? They said, we have a law school, and they don't run a court, and we have an engineering school, and they don't run a railroad. But the argument was that you could deliver a better instruction for medical care by teaching students in a clinical setting. And the next slide shows the very first university hospital in the United States. This was a former professor's home on North University Avenue. This was not unusual that hospitals would look like houses. And this modest-looking building is the precursor for literally every single university hospital in the country. And we should be very proud of that. The next slide shows the old main hospital that Kara Gavin mentioned, and I imagine there are some people on this webinar who could remember seeing that hospital in the flesh. When I came to the university, this was the hospital that we worked in. The next slide shows the VA hospital. Veterans Administration has been an important partner with the medical school since 1953. The next slide shows Old Main together with the new hospital. Well, it was the new hospital. It's soon to become the not so new hospital. And as the old Main came down, I took a few pictures, next slide, showing what it looked like as it was coming down. Next slide. And I like to look at these pictures and imagine what was happening inside the rooms. You see windows there. Think for a moment about what happened in each of those patient rooms. People lived, people died, people got good news, people got bad news. You know, medicine, despite the big buildings, is very much a human endeavor of human beings taking care of each other. And the next slide shows the current medical complex. Current as of now, in a month or so. The next slide shows the new Pavilion Hospital, scheduled to open up quite soon. Now let's turn to Michigan's leadership role, the medical school, in terms of teaching, in terms of giving a diverse education. The next slide shows a proclamation by the Board of Regents in 1870 saying that any resident of Michigan could go to the school. It didn't say anything about race. It didn't say anything about gender. It just said that anybody could attend. And the next slide emphasizes that in 1870, the University of Michigan became the first major medical school in the United States to admit women. And the next slide shows women standing with the graduating class of 1875. Next slide. I wish I could say they were accepted on all the same terms. This picture shows women on one side of the auditorium, men on the other. You can't see a red line that's running down the aisle, but women were supposed to stay on one side of the line and not cross it. That's true. On the other hand, even the professors who opposed women entering medical school were quick to admit that women, in fact, did well and perhaps even better than many of the men. But the history of the University of Michigan Medical School doesn't only include chapters about which we should be proud, but others about which we should be less pleased and about which we can learn. And I'm going to turn to one of those briefly here. Unfortunately, structural racism has been part of the history of the United States for over 400 years. And Michigan is not immune, nor is the practice of medicine immune. For the first African American medical student to enroll at the University of Michigan Medical School was a gentleman from Detroit by the name of Alpheus Tucker. I wish I could show you a picture of him. I don't think one exists. I haven't been able to find one. He applied to the University of Michigan Medical School in 1863. That's in the middle of the United States Civil War, a war that was being fought over the future of African American people such as Alpheus Tucker and their right to be treated as equal citizens. Alas, I could tell you he was the first African American student to graduate from the University of Michigan. He was not. When he entered the medical school, the medical students met him with jeers and shouts of "take him out." And I'm sorry to say that those students were supported by some of the faculty. And after a few days, he was forced to leave. The next slide is an image that was found by the wonderful Clements Library here on our campus. It shows the admission ledger for 1863 for the medical school. You will notice that you do not see Alpheus Tucker's name on this ledger. That's because after he was forced out of the medical school, his name was erased and another man's name was written over it. So we talk about people being erased from the pages of history. Alpheus Tucker was literally erased from the pages of history. Next slide. Tucker wrote a letter about his experiences to a Detroit newspaper. That's quite compelling reading. You can read the title of it there. A colored man expelled from the medical department of the state university. If you go to the next slide, there's an excerpt from the letter. It's quite a poignant letter in which he says, "I, a native of the state, a supporter of the university through my taxes, am denied an attendance because from an accident of birth, I am a shade or two darker than my fellow students." Next slide. I'm delighted to report that Tucker was able to complete his degree elsewhere. He became one of 13 African American surgeons who served in the Civil War and went on to a successful career in Washington, D.C. So in summary, this snippet of examples from the history of our medical schools should remind us that we have much to be proud of at the University of Michigan. We have served a leadership role that has affected medical schools throughout the country and perhaps the world. But we also need to remember that our history includes missteps and mistakes and ways in which we reflected the faults of the larger society, and we should continue to be aware of that and try harder to learn from them and do as best we can as we look towards the future. Next, I would like to introduce for our next presentation Dr. Powel Kazanjian, who will discuss how scientific discoveries about microbes laid the foundation for treating infectious diseases from the 1890s all the way through the age of COVID.
Thank you, Joel. Today in the news, the continued need for funding by federal research of medical investigations at the basic level and clinical level are a hot topic. And when we think back of when that all began and how medical and laboratory research was constructed, oftentimes we think of the early 30s and maybe 40s with the introduction of NIH funding, and perhaps earlier than that with philanthropic funding by the Rockefeller Institute in the turn of the 20th century. But at Michigan, we have actually can look at an earlier time period in the 1880s and 1890s when it began with the foundation of the hygienic laboratory seen here at the University of Michigan campus. And the hygienic laboratory was a key moment in public health when the bacteriology laboratories were being introduced into public health, as opposed to old sort of sanitary, environmental type of endeavors. efforts to interrupt spread of disease by interfering with the pathogen and the host or its environmental vectors. The dean of the medical school, Victor Vaughan, and one of his star students, Frederick Novy, became interested in putting that on the campus of the University of Michigan to sort of facilitate broader interests than routine academic interests in the university, and reciprocally to give a more scientific type of laboratory that could feed off of the university's strengths in chemistry to microbiology. And the person who took charge of the lab when he was a medical student was Frederick Novy, here seen a year after he graduated from medical school in his laboratory. And together, Vaughan and Novy sort of plotted and envisioned a role for research in addition to service to the state. And the role they envisioned in research was that that microbiology and bacteriology to that point hadn't really thoroughly defined the biologic behavior of organisms, what they metabolize, how they respire, how they divide, how they become spores. And they argued for attaching a research component to their service component to find out and discover these basic facts about microbes and their relationship to humans and the environment. Now, the practicality of this, you might say, is interesting, because why would a state be interested in funding medical research? And Novy addressed that in his letters to justify funding the laboratory to the state lab. And what he said is that basically that the more that's known about the biology of microbes will eventually be of therapeutic importance, whether that connection is known at the time of the research or not. And that in unforeseen ways, knowing more about the basic behavior of these organisms will someday pay back for us. And as a result of his investigations, he indeed, over a 30-year span, learned a large amount about respiration of microbes and their basic behavior. And in addition to doing research on this, another component of his work in the state lab was to teach. And he was, at this point, a fully funded researcher at the medical school, a new breed of researchers, a new breed of teachers at the medical school who didn't practice medicine, but conducted research. And he used this to establish the first medical course in bacteriology in the country. And here's a picture of his laboratory book that he used for that purpose. And he also trained a number of students, including Paul de Kruif, shown here, who went on after studying with Novy to become a popular writer and who popularized the story of Novy in several venues. Here's a letter written by de Kruif to Novy saying how he valued his attention to pure research and truth searching. And this theme was echoed in a collaboration with Sinclair Lewis in his popular book, Arrowsmith, where a mentor to one of the students is based after Novy and his adventurous pursuit of pure truth, which was portrayed in a valorous sort of noble manner in the book, and helped to popularize in general culture the value of laboratory research in medicine. So Novi, I think, is a key figure. He allows us to have a glimpse into a moment in the 1880s and 1890s when laboratory research was introduced into medical school, into the medical curriculum. And I think his ideas have borne truth over a century later, where basic mechanisms of microbial behavior uh, indeed have led to discoveries, whether they be antiretroviral agents, vaccines, or antibiotics. This all began before NIH funding, before philanthropic funding in the 1890s at a local level where the vision for doing research was tagged on to service at a hygienic laboratory. So that's the end of my talk, and now I would like to introduce Dr. Laura Hirshbein, who is ready to discuss the history of Michigan's contributions in the realms of child mental health and how the history of multidisciplinary collaborations can inspire a big vision.
Thank you, Powell. So can I have the first slide? So in the years right after World War II, Americans were very concerned about mental health. They were concerned about adult mental health after a huge number of neuropsychiatric casualties, what we would now call PTSD, affected men who had been fighting in the war. And they were also really concerned about child mental health. The world was a mess. We'd had two world wars following on the Great Depression, and people were very concerned about how children were going to do. And this was a big concern in the state of Michigan because there were very few resources to take care of children. There were two clinics in the state in 1848. There was one in Saginaw and one in Detroit, and that was it. And there were no places to train practitioners to take care of children and their mental health. So Raymond Wagner, who was the very influential chair of psychiatry at the time, had a vision. He wanted to create a comprehensive child health center that would include both pediatrics, the specialty to take care of children, and child psychiatry. There was no children's hospital here at the university at that time, and so he designed, in collaboration with pediatrics, a building that was supposed to have both. It was supposed to be a 200-bed comprehensive center. Well, Wagner managed to convince the regents of the university and the state to go ahead and fund this here in Ann Arbor, even though the state had wanted to fund a child mental health program in Northville, Michigan. But Wagner convinced them to build it here. And he also managed to convince them to build the psychiatry part of the building first. So the building that you see here was Children's Psychiatric Hospital that was built in 1955. And the building was intended to have a mirror opposite. The tall structure on the right hand of the building was supposed to, the wall on the right hand side is supposed to be torn down, and a matching and inverted picture was supposed to be the pediatric side. But Wagner managed to get the psychiatry piece built first. There's a lore in our department that he had an in-law in the state legislature, which is how he managed to get the psychiatry piece first. The state wound up not funding the pediatrics section, and so more than 10 years later, pediatrics went to the Mott Foundation in Flint and was able to get funding for what was the new Mott Hospital in 1969. Can we have the next slide? So the approach in Children's Psychiatric Hospital was cutting edge. This was state of the art, and the state of the art in the early 1950s for child psychiatry was psychoanalysis. So Sigmund Freud had developed psychoanalysis for adults, but his daughter Anna Freud was the one who adapted it for children. And the idea was that we knew that adults suffered from unconscious conflicts that affected their behavior and affected their choices they made in life. And so Anna Freud argued that what should happen is that if you work with children to prevent those conflicts from happening, that children would do better in the future. Next slide. So what the hospital was supposed to be was a home environment, home-like environment to take care of kids, to help them work on these unconscious conflicts. And it was supposed to be hospitable enough that it felt like home, but not too much so that kids didn't want to leave. So the room here we see here, the 2-bedroom, it looks pretty institutional now, but compared to the large wards for multiple children at the time, this was pretty home-like. And the children got activities that were age and gender appropriate for the time. Next slide. One of the reasons that Wagner was successful in getting the state to fund the program here in Ann Arbor as opposed to somewhere else is he made the argument that what we could do here is educate, and educate not just child psychiatrists, but also nurses, social workers, teachers. So here are pictures of 2 special education teachers who worked with kids at Children's Psychiatric Hospital, and they all went on to help educate other special educators in the state. We educated occupational therapists, recreational therapists, psychiatric care workers, and a variety of other people who worked with these children. Next slide. For a time, CPH attracted local and national attention. We had all kinds of activities and all kinds of people, and a huge number of folks gathered to take care of what was actually a relatively small number of kids. Next slide. One of the things with this program is that it was also intended to include research. So here is an Ann Arbor News portrayal of all the different kinds of research that could happen at Children's Psychiatric Hospital. And this was much bigger than just individual kids in individual clinical trials. This was imagining how research, gathering information about how kids interacted with their parents, with their communities, and it was connected to the Mental Health Research Institute, which is also part of University of Michigan Department of Psychiatry, that included everything from wet labs looking at cells all the way up to society. There was a sociologist and a historian on staff at the Mental Health Research Institute. Next slide. But there were issues. So child psychiatry took up a lot of real estate. If you look, you may or may not be able to see at the top of the medical center campus where CPH was with that very distinctive looking architecture. That site is where the cancer center is now. So that got torn down. So there's a big space issue. The other thing is that child psychiatry stopped being seen as so important, as evidenced by the fact that at one point our chair complained that they were landing the emergency helicopter in the drive in front of the Children's Psychiatric Hospital, which was disrupting the activities. The CPH wound up not being able to help that many kids. The length of stay turned out to be 2 or 3 years. And so there was a lot of concern that all this effort was being put into a small number of kids and it wasn't helping as much of the community as could be helped. Next paragraph. Oh, sorry, next slide. The Children's Psychiatric Hospital got torn down in 1990 and the 2 units got put into what became the Maternal Child Health Center in 1990. And child psychiatry really kind of fell off the map. It wasn't part of interdisciplinary conversations anymore. And in fact, when the new children's hospital was built in 2012, child psychiatry wasn't in it at all. It had to be included somewhat later. So I think Children's Psychiatric Hospital offers a wonderful opportunity to look at a big vision and look at the benefit of thinking broadly and the missed opportunities that sometimes we've had when we've gotten distracted by other activities and let slide something that maybe was a little bit more important. So I'd like to end our presentations with Dr. Lisa Harris, who will give us an overview of why it's important to reflect on our history and how she and her team at the new Center for History, Humanities, the Arts, Social Sciences, and Ethics in Medicine, CHASM, are working to do that.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. As you heard, I'm an OBGYN and a cultural historian here at U of M, and I direct a new center. And I'll say more about it later, but briefly, CHASM's reason for being is to use interdisciplinary lenses and approaches to address the most complex challenges in medicine. So these are the kind of things that biomedical approaches alone can't solve. Health inequities, the social and structural barriers to care that determine most of a person's health, and the fact that patients and care providers alike are really yearning for more humanity and compassion in medical care. And work in all of the 5 arenas that you see here, these are the 5 component parts of CHASM, is needed to address this. So today I'd like to offer a case study of sorts in this from a recent chapter in Michigan Medicine's history. And the story that I'll share unfolds at the intersection of history, of art, of social structures, and ethics. And it centers on the painting on the next slide. This is a 1952 painting by artist Robert Thom. And it depicts on the right gynecologist J. Marion Sims and 3 of the enslaved women upon whom he conducted surgical experiments without anesthesia. And you see 1 on the table and 2 peering around a curtain on the side. And he did this work in his effort to cure vesicovaginal fistula, which is a complication of childbirth. Michigan Medicine owns this painting. Next slide. It is one in a series of 45 paintings commissioned by Parke Davis, the pharmaceutical company, in the 1950s. Parke Davis, as many of you know, is a Detroit-based company. It was eventually acquired by Pfizer. But Parke Davis asked Michigan artist Robert Thom to create a series of paintings depicting the history of medicine. That was later published as a book, next slide, called Great Moments in Medicine. And apparently, Great Moments in Medicine with that title came about without any reflection really on the question of for whom scenes like the one I showed you a moment ago were truly great moments. The paintings were part of a promotional campaign for the pharmaceutical industry meant to capture its important role in making medicine modern. And many people had the images hanging in their homes, in calendars, or they saw them in magazines. And Thom became known as the sort of Norman Rockwell of medicine. In 2007, Pfizer, who then owned the paintings, donated them all to Michigan Medicine. Nearly all of the paintings, next slide, currently line the hallways of the medical school and hospital. Many of you may have seen them. And if you walk by them, you can take a tour through the history of medicine from ancient Egypt, next slide, to the Renaissance, next slide, to the past century. Next slide. But you won't see this one on display. For almost 20 years, it was stored in the basement of University of Michigan's Museum of Art, out of sight. We now know that the 3 women depicted here were Lucy, Betsy, and Anarcha. They were girls. Actually, they were all aged 17 to 19. They and at least 20 more girls and women whose names are lost to history were the people upon whom Sims operated and re-operated, sometimes as many as 7 times. And again, as I said earlier, without anesthesia, as he looked for a way to surgically repair obstetric fistula. History has famously recorded Sims as the quote-unquote father of modern gynecology. And after developing his surgical techniques and instruments on the bodies of enslaved women and girls, he became quite famous and quite rich as a gynecologist to wealthy white women in New York and even to European royalty. But the mothers of gynecology, meaning Lucy, Betsy, Anarcha, and others, were not recognized until relatively recently. Now, many people first came to know about the stories of these 3 women through the work of historian Harriet Washington, next slide, in her 2006 book, Medical Apartheid. This book traces the history of medical experimentation on Black Americans. And Washington had wanted to use the Thom painting on the cover of her book. However, Pfizer, which at that point owned the rights to it, read the introduction to her book, read the argument of her book, and they declined to let her use this painting, which in Washington's words was an act of censorship. So you're probably thinking, how does this connect to Michigan Medicine's own history? Well, after the paintings were donated to us, this one, because of its difficult subject matter, was not displayed with all the others. Instead, it went to the OBGYN department. That's sort of, when you don't know how to handle a complex problem and you don't know how to talk about it, call OBGYN. So I think that's sort of what happened here. But the painting was never hung there. Dr. Tim Johnson, who was the chair and one of my most important and cherished mentors, who very sadly passed away recently, Dr. Johnson listened to the chorus of voices of faculty and staff, in particular women of color, who did not want to have to see this painful history daily at work. And so from OBGYN, the painting went to the Office of Health Equity and Inclusion, where it was displayed briefly, but ultimately was taken down for similar reasons. It caused pain for people to see it. And from there, it went to the Museum of Art, where it was in storage for almost 20 years and very rarely ever seen. So as an institution, we never found a way to display or talk about the complexity of this painting, that displaying it caused people harm, and in addition, not displaying it caused a different kind of harm, of censorship, of erasure, of a horrifying chapter of medical history that needs to be reckoned with insofar as it has direct connections to contemporary care dynamics. For example, the well-documented phenomenon of obstetric racism. A few months ago, this painting got a new home where it could be displayed and bring healing instead of harm. Working closely with Elaine Sims from Gifts of Art, our new center, Chasm, helped secure the loan of this painting to Alabama artist and activist Michelle Browder. Next slide, please. Ms. Browder is a metal sculptor and creator of the Mothers of Gynecology Monument and Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. Next slide. This is the monument she built to Lucy and Betsy in Anarcha. It's 14 feet tall. It's astounding, and it's beautiful and poignant and painful. Next slide. You can see in this close-up that it is constructed in large part from surgical instruments. You see scissors and surgical needles here. Ms. Browder's mission is to use art and history to have, in her words, courageous conversations. On the next slide, you can see that in March, we held an event here with Ms. Browder to mark the loan of the painting to her and to lift up the stories of Lucy and Betsy and Anarcha and others. 3 of Anarcha's direct descendants were able to be here, and it was really a remarkable event. This was Chasm's inaugural event, and I'm happy to share more about the center in the Q&A if there's time. Shortly after this event in May, next slide, the painting was delivered to Montgomery, Alabama, where it now has a home in Browder's museum honoring the Mothers of Gynecology. And her museum, next slide, is in the very building where Sims did his surgical experimentation. Next slide. So the mothers are home. I was able to be there, as you can see.
Welcome home. God is good.
It was incredibly powerful to be there for that moment. I was able, next slide, to bring 7 University of Michigan students with me to witness how powerful it was for there to now be a place where history can be reckoned with, but in a way that allows for healing. Browder's museum is evidence that these kinds of spaces are possible, and she offers inspiration to us here at U of M as we build and grow our new interdisciplinary center. Next slide. And our hope, our goal is that it too can be a place that can use history and art and additional fields to help manage complexity and to reckon with painful history in ways that are generative and healing. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it back over to Kara Gavin for further discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris, and to all of our panelists for joining us. And we appreciate that all of our panelists took time from very demanding schedules to share their work with us. And I'd like to invite all of them to come back on camera, and we will invite our audience to use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit questions if you're watching live. If you're watching on another mechanism or after the fact, sorry we're not able to take your questions, but we'll try and address as many as we can. And we had some that came in advance. One that actually I believe, Joel, you might be able to address, which is, when was high school graduation and undergraduate education expected or required of our incoming medical students? And also, if you could touch on this, someone's asking about the Flexner report. So, Joel, I think this is in your wheelhouse.
Sure. It was a gradual process, as you might expect. It came about mainly in the 1880s and the 1890s. We started to require a year or 2 of college and gradually a full college degree. The Flexner report, for those who don't know, is a report commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation about the state of medical education in the United States. Abraham Flexner went around the country visiting every medical school and wrote a report about which ones were good and which ones were bad. And the ones that were bad were truly horrendous. Michigan was one that he held up as being an exemplar. It was one of a handful, literally a handful, of schools that he thought were doing the right thing and doing it well. One of the interesting criticisms he had, perhaps the only criticism he had really, was that Ann Arbor was such a small town and it would be better if the medical school were to move to Detroit. I'll leave it to you and the audience to just think about how different things would be if the medical school existed in Detroit.
Fantastic. And actually, we could probably get further into that because that argument dates back to the early days of the medical school as well, I think. Laura, let's turn to you. And, we're hearing so much about the mental health care access crisis in our country, especially for young people right now. And we know more now than in the days you were describing about how to diagnose and treat mental health conditions. So how can we use history to help us address the urgent needs we have today?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that maybe we've forgotten that we left behind is really kind of thinking very broadly in a very multidisciplinary way about child mental health. There was a time when to think about mental health in children meant looking at everything, looking at how they grew up and what their neighborhoods were like, and being attuned to the fact that poverty and racism worsen mental health. So there was a time when child psychiatrists really, and child psychiatry in general, thought that we need to think big, not just about getting access, that it's a much bigger problem. And I think that's the kind of perspective we need to think about. It goes well beyond just scaling up. How can we deliver a very packaged kind of thing? Mental health is complicated, and it continues to be complicated in this very rough world that we have. And so the parallels from 75 years ago are quite relevant right now.
Fantastic. Powell, question for you. If you wanted to go into any other milestones in our history around treating infectious diseases as well as studying them. And I believe we used to have a contagious disease hospital. Is that correct? And you're muted.
Well, that antedated me. We did. It was at the turn of the 20th century. But the details in that hospital I actually don't know as well. But one of the things in answer to your first question was that one thing that was accompanying the change in criteria for medical students and the improvement in the caliber of medical students was the introduction of science into the curriculum. And until that time, this had been a sort of a foreign language, somewhat of a abstruse concept. But with the need to understand and know science, that led to improvements and construction of admission criteria and to improve the caliber of students. And also increasing time for laboratory studies, which, as Joel mentioned, led to the expansion into 4 years. I've seen references to the hospital you're mentioning, but I don't know any specifics on it.
Great, no problem. Back to Joel. So from the very beginning, you noted that the faculty were full members of the university faculty, but also they were the physicians at the hospitals. And that is still true today. And so I wonder if you could talk more about that relationship and how it's made a difference perhaps through time.
It's made a huge difference. For one thing, the hospital and the university are side by side. I mean, you can literally walk from the medical school to the university. Many of our peer institutions, you cannot. Harvard is in 2 different cities. Cornell is cities several hundred miles apart. Even places like Johns Hopkins, the 6 miles from the university to the medical school. And this has real tangible impact. I'll give you one example. We have something called an endoscope, which enables you to look down into the gastrointestinal tract, into the pulmonary tract. It's based on the notion of fiber optics, that you can transmit a picture through a flexible tube. That was discovered here at the University of Michigan with a collaboration between a medical school professor and a physics professor. So the fact that these 2 professors could easily get together and create something as important as the endoscope is. I mean, during the course of this webinar, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of endoscopes have been used around the world. That's one example of the beauty and the advantage of linking the medical school with the university.
And also important to note that the physicians at the VA hospital down the road are also on the faculty.
Absolutely.
Yeah, wonderful. Lisa, I wonder if you wanted to go a little further into your center. I don't know if we can pull up that one slide you had in reserve, but this idea of connecting people across professions and to examine history or learn from it.
Sure, thank you. Yes, I'm happy to have that slide pulled up if you're able, but if not, it's not essential. But the bottom line with the formation of this new center is recognizing that there's a gap between what healthcare and medicine is and what it needs to be or what it could be. Meaning, I listed some of the challenges before. The biomedicine is breathtaking, and what it can do is miraculous and amazing. And it doesn't do that for all people. Medicine has enormous challenges. What happens between a doctor and a patient in an office or hospital is actually the smallest determinant of health compared to other social and structural ones. Racism and other kinds of discrimination get reproduced in medicine. And as I mentioned before, everybody in medicine, learners, care providers, patients, are wanting something better and more humane. And I think one of U of M's big strengths is that partly because of the way the campus is set up, as Joel was just alluding to, we can have conversations across discipline. And the kind of challenges that medicine faces are not ones whose answers lie in biomedicine alone. They're going to need people looking at things from different perspectives with different disciplinary backgrounds. And that's what the goal of this new center is. You can see here that there are 5 component parts: ethics, history, humanities, arts, and social sciences. And then those dots on the periphery are meant to represent programs in those areas. So we have a number of programs. We have a medical arts program with which Joel, who you heard from today, ran for many years. We are teaching a history of medicine course. We obviously, the 175th med school anniversary is a far bigger scope than just our center, but the museum exhibit, for example, tonight that some of you may see, was put together by Alex Navarro, who's part of our center. So our goal is to de-silo, have a home, a space where people from lots of disciplines who all care about healthcare can work together to solve the big problems that biomedicine alone can't solve.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And we had some questions about what we're doing to teach our own history to our medical students, and I think you've just addressed that. We also had a question that relates to something I wanted to ask as well. So folks are wondering maybe a positive change that you've seen in your field during your career, and then also what you hope to see in the future. And that could be, a particular clinical thing or a person whose work inspired current work. So I'll ask each of you to perhaps reflect on that. And I don't know who would like to go first.
If I can jump in, I'm going to link with what Lisa Harris just said. Way back when I started medical school, I was told by very distinguished professors that my job was to learn the anatomy and the physiology and the biochemistry and the pathophysiology, and that anything that went on outside of the patient was simply not my concern. As a doctor, I should not be concerned with, I should not care about the social world in which we live. And one of the wonderful changes in the 50 years since I walked into my first year of medical school has been the recognition of how important that is. And I think Lisa and the center that she directs and the fact that that exists are examples of how we have become to be increasingly aware. Yes, you need to know the pathophysiology, you need the anatomy and the pharmacodynamics and all that stuff. But if you don't know or care about why the person is sick, then you're being an inadequate provider of healthcare. So that's a wonderful change I've seen.
I think the biggest thing for me is the vast changes in the medical school composition. When I was a medical student, My class was unusually 40% women. It was 25% before, 25% after. And the person who was chair of the admissions committee the year that they admitted 40% women got fired because that was too many women. This was in the late 80s, so this was not forever ago. And our medical school classrooms are so diverse now. These students are amazing, all kinds of all kinds of shapes, sizes, backgrounds, ethnicities, races, racial composition, just everything. And they have fascinating stories and great things that they're bringing to medicine. And it's super inspiring.
Yeah, from my viewpoint, I think it has been the interdisciplinary aspects that everybody's really been talking about. And for me in infectious diseases to have the ability to collaborate with the history department and be a member of the history department. And several of our faculty have collaborations and co-appointments in basic science departments like micro and immunology, or in the on campus with evolutionary biology. I think that has been a real tremendous benefit and has allowed for a really more in-depth scholarship and as well as more broader views on everything that's mutually beneficial. So I've been very favorably impressed with that.
And I would add, I'm an OBGYN, so I care for women, I care for people when they are pregnant or giving birth. And in that context, I would say that a shift in paternalism, it has been a really important change that I've seen, even just in the years that I've been in medicine, that increasingly we can see, we're able to see the power dynamics between patients and their care providers, and increasingly we're able to see patients themselves as experts in what is going on in their bodies. So that's been a big shift I'm so grateful for.
Thank you. Thank you all. That was a wonderful reflection to end on, and a great discussion today. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today and submitting great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but we have lots more information about our history online at mishmed.org/history. And I'd like to invite everyone who's watching, live or recording, to come explore the museum exhibit that we've put together in honor of our 175th anniversary. It's running from this weekend through April 30th of 2026 at the Museum on Main Street near Carytown in Ann Arbor. And it's open Saturdays and Sundays from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. for free admission. And you can also arrange for a free private tour for your group on weekdays by contacting the museum directly. And you can find information about all of this at mishmed.org/museum. And those of you who pre-registered for today's event or are watching this on social, you'll find an email link to that as well. I'd like to extend our gratitude to all the donors who support our efforts in so many ways. And if you'd like to salute our 175th anniversary by helping fund the future of innovation at Michigan Medicine, you can give at the link on our website, or you can even buy a t-shirt or a jacket with our 175th emblem on it, and the proceeds will go to our anniversary fund. We're going to follow up with everyone who registered in advance with an email very soon with a recording and links for more information. We will also put this video on the Michigan Medicine YouTube channel to share with anyone you'd like. And I encourage you to visit our Well Aware website to stay informed, because these webinars happen quarterly. Thank you again, and go blue.